Most blacks, especially African Americans, always refer back to the injustice of slavery and always claim victims. But what if it wasn't always as we were taught in school? What if Africans played a major role in it? This is not to justify slavery by any means. It was bad and inhumane, but getting a balanced view of what really happened would make more sense. Stick with us. Slavery, one of humanity's oldest and darkest traditions. It is the practice of reducing a fellow human being to property, used for labor at the will of another. And for thousands of years, it was woven into the fabric of civilizations across the earth. But among all systems of slavery, none has captured more global attention or inflicted more generational trauma than the transatlantic slave trade. Over 12 million souls were taken from the shores of Africa, forced onto ships, shackled, sold, torn from their families to fuel the wealth of empires across the Atlantic. Yet, hidden beneath this horrifying chapter of history lies another story, one that is often forgotten or silenced. The story of African involvement in slavery, not just as victims, but as participants, as profiteers, as powers. This is that untold story. Slavery in Africa did not begin with European ships. In fact, it did not even begin in the last millennium. In ancient Egypt, slaves toiled in the fields and monuments of the Nile. The great pyramids that still pierce the desert sky were built not just by free laborers, as some modern historians suggest, but by countless enslaved hands. Hieroglyphs tell us of captured Nubians, Libyans, and Asiatics who were branded and forced into servitude. Egyptian pharaohs boasted of taking tens of thousands of prisoners in single military campaigns, reducing entire populations to bondage. Carthage, the North African powerhouse, bought and sold human beings across the Mediterranean. This maritime empire, which once challenged Rome itself, built its wealth not just on trade in gold and ivory, but on human cargo. Carthaginian merchants established slave markets from Spain to Sicily, trafficking in captured Europeans, Africans, and Middle Easterners alike. The mighty kings of Aksum, in what is now Ethiopia, bragged of the slaves they took in war. Stone inscriptions from the 4th century describe King Ezana's military campaigns, where victory was measured not just in territory conquered, but in the number of people enslaved. These captives became the foundation of Aksumite agriculture and craftsmanship. For centuries, African slaves were already being traded beyond the continent, through the Sahara, across the Indian Ocean, and deep into the Islamic world. The trans-Saharan slave trade predated European involvement by nearly 1,000 years. Caravans of enslaved Africans trudged across the burning sands, bound for markets in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba. Over 10 million Africans were dragged across the desert to be sold in Middle Eastern markets. The journey itself was a death sentence for many. The Sahara consumed the weak, leaving bleached bones scattered along ancient trade routes. 5 million more were shipped through Indian Ocean ports. Dhows and merchant vessels carried African slaves to Persia, India, and the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. In these distant lands, African slaves became household servants, plantation workers, and palace guards. Some rose to positions of influence, like the city admirals who served Indian princes, but most lived and died in anonymity. Male slaves in the Islamic world were often castrated, a brutal practice that erased their lineages and ensured the demand never ceased. This systematic emasculation meant that, unlike in the Americas, enslaved populations in Islamic territories could not reproduce and establish communities. Each generation required fresh imports from Africa, feeding an insatiable appetite for human bondage that lasted over a millennium. The Zanj rebellion of the 9th century reveals the scale of this trade. Hundreds of thousands of African slaves, working in the salt marshes of southern Iraq, rose in revolt against their Arab masters. The rebellion lasted 14 years and required massive military campaigns to suppress. Yet even after this uprising, the trade continued unabated. West Africa, in particular, had its own long tradition of slavery. Far removed from Islamic raids and the Indian Ocean trade, it developed its own powerful empires. The Ghana Empire, Mali Empire, and Songhai each built their foundations on conquest and human bondage. In the courts of these kingdoms, slavery was not merely an economic institution. It was a marker of civilization itself. To own slaves was to demonstrate power, wealth, and divine favor. The Ghana Empire, which flourished from the 6th to 13th centuries, controlled the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure through slave labor. Arabic sources describe caravans of 1,000 camels carrying gold, salt, and slaves northward to the Mediterranean world. The empire's capital, Kumbi Saleh, housed elaborate slave markets where captives from across West Africa were bought, sold, and redistributed. The riches of Mansa Musa, gold, copper, salt, were all dug from the earth by slaves. When this legendary ruler made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 to 1325, he traveled with a retinue that included 60,000 people, many of them slaves. His display of wealth was so extravagant that it caused inflation in Egypt that lasted for a decade. But behind this golden splendor lay the suffering of countless enslaved miners, farmers, and craftsmen who generated Mali's prosperity. Mali even imported women from the Mediterranean to serve in elite homes. These foreign slaves, often Berbers or Arabs captured in raids, were prized for their exotic beauty and served as concubines and domestic servants in royal households. The practice created a complex hierarchy where some slaves enjoyed better conditions than free peasants, while others faced brutal exploitation. Successor kingdoms like the Jolof and Kabu inherited this structure. The Jolof Empire, which controlled much of modern Senegal and Gambia, organized its entire society around slave labor. Royal chronicles describe elaborate ceremonies where hundreds of slaves were given as gifts to visiting dignitaries or sacrificed to ensure good harvests. In these societies, owning slaves wasn't just practical, it was prestigious. A free man's status was measured by the number of slaves he owned. Wealthy families passed down enslaved people like livestock, creating dynasties of bondage that lasted generations. Marriage negotiations often centered on the exchange of slaves, and funeral rites included the sacrifice of personal servants to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The Kabu Kingdom, centered in modern Guinea-Bissau, developed particularly sophisticated slave management systems. They established specialized villages where different types of slaves lived and worked: agricultural slaves in farming communities, craft slaves in manufacturing centers, and domestic slaves in urban households. This division of labor maximized productivity while minimizing the risk of rebellion. Some slaves worked the land, their calloused hands producing the millet, rice, and yams that fed the empire. Others served as soldiers, wielding spears and shields in the armies of their masters. These slave soldiers, known as Tonjon in some regions, often proved more loyal than free warriors, having no clan loyalties to divide their allegiance. Some even rose to become political advisors. In the court of the Mali emperor, enslaved administrators managed vast territories and commanded respect from noble families. These fortunate few lived in luxury, wore fine clothes, and wielded considerable influence, yet they remained property, their elevated status dependent entirely on their master's whims. In rare cases, a slave could earn freedom by cultivating land in their spare time. Islamic law, which influenced many West African kingdoms, provided mechanisms for manumission. A slave who converted to Islam and demonstrated exceptional service might be granted freedom, though this was uncommon. More often, slaves were allowed to work small plots of land during their free hours, with the possibility of eventually purchasing their freedom, a process that might take decades. In other cases, they were sacrificed to mark royal ceremonies. The death of a king or the coronation of his successor often required human blood to satisfy the ancestors. Slaves were the preferred sacrificial victims, their lives deemed less valuable than those of free subjects. Archaeological evidence from royal burial sites across West Africa reveals the skeletons of dozens of people buried alongside their masters, testament to this grim practice. This was not a monolithic system. Slavery in Africa was complex, its own internal logic, hierarchies, and brutality. Unlike the plantation slavery that would later develop in the Americas, African slavery encompassed a spectrum of conditions. Some slaves were integrated into their master's family, eventually becoming trusted advisors or even inheriting property. Others faced conditions as harsh as any plantation overseer would impose. When the Portuguese arrived in the mid-1400s, Africa was not a land of scattered tribes. It was a continent of kingdoms, empires, and established power structures. European explorers encountered sophisticated political systems, bustling cities, and complex trade networks that had operated for centuries. The Portuguese first reached the Gold Coast in 1471, where they found the Akan peoples mining gold with slave labor. They sailed up the Congo River and met the powerful Manikongo, who ruled over millions of subjects from his capital at Mbanza, Congo. They established trading posts along the Senegambian coast, where local rulers controlled access to interior markets, and slavery was already well established. European newcomers didn't introduce the concept of human bondage to Africa. They simply redirected existing trade routes toward new destinations. At first, European ships took slaves back to Europe. In Lisbon and Seville, African slaves worked in households, shipyards, and sugar plantations. But this changed in 1526, when Portugal sent the first slave ship directly across the Atlantic to Brazil. The discovery of the New World created an unprecedented demand for labor, and Africa's established slave trading networks were perfectly positioned to supply it. The scale of this demand soon dwarfed anything Africa had experienced. Where traditional African slavery involved thousands of people, the Atlantic trade would eventually transport millions. European colonization of the Americas created vast plantations producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee, crops that required intensive labor in tropical conditions that European workers couldn't survive. Contrary to popular belief, the vast majority of African slaves were not kidnapped kidnapped by Europeans. They were sold by African rulers, merchants, and warlords who saw opportunity in this new trade. European traders rarely ventured beyond coastal trading posts, relying instead on African intermediaries to supply captives from the interior. In return, Europeans offered firearms, ceramics, cloth, goods that elevated local elites and transformed African societies. Iron bars, cowrie shells, and gunpowder became the currencies of a new economy built on human trafficking. European goods, especially firearms, revolutionized African warfare and tipped the balance of power toward those kingdoms that embraced the slave trade. This trade became the backbone of a vast economic engine that connected 3 continents. Ships carried manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, slaves from Africa to the Americas, and raw materials from the Americas back to Europe. But it was not built by Europe alone. It required the active participation of African merchants, rulers, and warriors who controlled the supply of human cargo. The transformation was profound. Kingdoms that had previously raided for captives to use as domestic slaves now organized massive expeditions to supply the Atlantic market. Wars that might have been fought for territory or honor became slave raids, with victory measured in the number of captives taken rather than land conquered. The Kingdom of Congo embraced the Portuguese with open arms. King Afonso I, who ruled from 1509 to 1542, was expansionist, devout Christian, and shrewd ruler who saw Portuguese trade as an opportunity to expand his power and influence. Afonso had converted to Christianity as a young prince, taking the name of his Portuguese patron. When he ascended to the throne, he invited Portuguese missionaries, craftsmen, and advisors to his court. He built churches, established schools, and even sent young Congolese nobles to study in Lisbon. But his most profitable relationship with the Portuguese involved the sale of human beings. He sold thousands of captives every year, mostly prisoners of war taken in his expansionist campaigns against neighboring kingdoms. Congo's armies swept across Central Africa, capturing entire villages and marching their inhabitants to coastal ports. Portuguese traders paid premium prices for these slaves, who were then shipped to Brazilian sugar plantations. But Afonso also tried to regulate the trade, demanding protection for his own subjects from rogue slavers. He wrote letters to the Portuguese king complaining about unauthorized slave raids and requesting that only legitimate prisoners of war be sold. His efforts to control the trade reflected both moral concerns and practical politics. Unregulated slaving threatened the stability of his own kingdom. Despite his complaints, Afonso continued to profit from the trade until his death. His successors maintained the relationship with Portugal, and Congo remained a major supplier of slaves for over 2 centuries. The kingdom's population declined dramatically, and its political structure eventually collapsed under the strain of constant warfare and population loss. The Akan peoples of the Gold Coast took a different approach. Rather than simply exporting slaves, they imported them to work in their own gold mines. European demand for African gold was intense, and Akan rulers discovered that slave labor could maximize their profits from this trade. They flooded their gold mines with slave labor, purchased from both African and European dealers. Akan merchants bought captives from northern kingdoms and European traders alike, creating a diverse enslaved population that included people from across West Africa. Up to 1/3 of their populations were enslaved, a proportion higher than most American slave societies. These enslaved miners worked in dangerous conditions, descending into narrow shafts and panning for gold in fast-flowing rivers. The mortality rate was horrific, requiring constant replacement of the workforce. But the profits were enormous. Akan gold helped fund the European age of exploration and made local rulers fabulously wealthy. Akan society developed elaborate systems to manage this large enslaved population. Slaves were organized into work gangs, supervised by trusted overseers, often former slaves themselves who had earned their freedom. Skilled craftsmen among the enslaved population produced tools, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that became symbols of Akan wealth and power. Solidarity among Africans was rare in this era. Ethnic divisions were deep and old, long before any white sails touched the horizon. The concept of African unity was foreign to people who identified primarily with their clan, village, or kingdom. Wars between African kingdoms were common, and enslaving one's enemies was an accepted practice that predated European contact. These divisions made the Atlantic slave trade possible. European traders exploited existing rivalries, providing weapons to some groups while encouraging them to raid their neighbors. The result was a cycle of violence that fed the slave markets and devastated entire regions of Africa. But not everyone welcomed the slave trade. Some African rulers recognized the long-term damage it would cause to their societies and took active steps to resist it. The Kingdom of Benin, powerful and proud, once participated in slaving during the early years of European contact. Benin's bronze plaques, created in the 16th century, depict Portuguese soldiers and traders alongside Benin warriors, evidence of early cooperation between the two powers. The kingdom initially sold some captives to Portuguese traders in exchange for European goods, but by the mid-1500s, it faced a crisis, a serious population decline caused by warfare, disease, and the export of people to other regions. Rulers Rulers like Oba Esigi chose to shut their ports to European traders and banned the export of slaves. This decision was made centuries before European abolitionists began their campaigns against the slave trade. The Oba's decision wasn't purely humanitarian, it was practical. Benin needed its population to maintain agricultural production, military strength, and the complex bronze casting industry that made the kingdom famous. Exporting people weakened the kingdom's foundations and threatened its survival. Still, domestic slavery persisted within Benin. The kingdom continued to use slaves for agricultural work, crafts production, and ritual purposes. When Britain tried to outlaw all forms of slavery in the 1800s, Benin resisted with force. The famous Benin Expedition of 1897, which resulted in the looting of the kingdom's bronze treasures, was partly justified by British claims that they were ending slavery and human sacrifice. The Oba's resistance to British interference culminated in the killing of a British delegation in 1897. The British response was swift and devastating, a punitive expedition that destroyed the ancient city, killed thousands of defenders, and carried off the kingdom's artistic treasures to European museums where they remain today. Perhaps no African kingdom is more infamous in the context of slavery than Dahomey. Located in what is now Benin, this militaristic state built its entire economy and culture around human bondage. Dahomey's military machine was unmatched in the region. The kingdom maintained a standing army of tens of thousands of soldiers, including the famous female warriors known as the Amazons. These troops were organized, disciplined, and equipped with both traditional weapons and European firearms purchased through the slave trade. The kingdom's economy was anchored in human bondage. Dahomey's rulers organized annual military campaigns called the Annual Customs that were designed primarily to capture slaves. These expeditions could involve 10,000 or more warriors and might range hundreds of miles from the capital, sweeping through villages and smaller kingdoms to gather human cargo. Slaves weren't just laborers in Dahomey. They were currency, status symbols, and religious offerings. The kingdom developed a complex classification system for enslaved people based on their origins, skills, and intended use. Some worked in agriculture, others in crafts production, and still others served as soldiers or palace guards. But perhaps most shocking to European observers was Dahomey's use of slaves in religious ceremonies. Each year, hundreds, sometimes thousands, were sacrificed in grand ceremonies designed to honor the ancestors and ensure the kingdom's prosperity. These rituals, known as the Annual Customs, were elaborate affairs that could last for weeks and involved the sacrifice of hundreds of captives. The most important ceremony was the commemoration of deceased kings, when massive numbers of slaves were killed to serve their masters in the afterlife. European observers described scenes of incredible brutality, with captives beheaded, burned alive, or thrown from high platforms. The blood of these victims was believed to nourish the spirits of the royal ancestors. King Gezo, who ruled from 1818 to 1858, was particularly associated with these practices. He reportedly declared that the slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. Under his rule, Dahomey reached the height of its power and brutality, exporting thousands of slaves annually while sacrificing thousands more in religious ceremonies. Even as Britain and France tried to end the slave trade through diplomatic pressure and naval patrols, Dahomey clung to it. The kingdom's entire social and economic structure depended on slavery, and abandoning the trade would have meant abandoning their way of life. Dahomey's rulers viewed European attempts to end the slave trade as attacks on their sovereignty and cultural traditions. The kingdom's resistance to abolition became increasingly violent. Dahomey's armies attacked European trading posts, captured European officials, and continued to export slaves despite international pressure. This defiance provided European powers with a moral justification for military intervention. When France invaded in 1892, it used Dahomey's refusal to end slavery and human sacrifice as moral justification for conquest. The French portrayed their invasion as a humanitarian mission to free enslaved people and end barbaric practices. This narrative, while partially true, also served to legitimize French colonial expansion in West Africa. The war was brief but brutal. Despite their military reputation, Dahomey's traditional weapons and tactics proved no match for French artillery and machine guns. By 1894, the kingdom fell, and its last king was exiled to Algeria, where he died in obscurity. The end of Dahomey marked the conclusion of Africa's last major slave trading kingdom. With French colonial control, the export of slaves from this region finally ended, though domestic slavery continued for decades under colonial rule. Another common myth is that colonization and slavery always went hand in hand. In truth, most of Europe's colonization of Africa came after slavery was abolished, not before. The scramble for Africa of the late 19th century occurred decades after European nations had outlawed the slave trade. In 1851, Britain attacked Lagos to stop the slave trade rather than to promote it. British forces bombarded the city, deposed its ruler, and installed a new king who agreed to end the export of slaves. They freed hundreds of captives awaiting shipment and expelled slave traders from the port. This pattern was repeated across West Africa. In 1861, Britain formally annexed annexed Lagos as a crown colony, largely to prevent the resumption of slave trading. British officials worked to redirect local economies away from slave exports toward the production of palm oil, groundnuts, and other legitimate commodities. They did the same in Benin in 1897, after the king sacrificed hundreds of people in ceremonies designed to stop the British advance. The British justified their conquest of Benin, partly as a humanitarian mission to end human sacrifice and slavery, though they were also motivated by commercial and strategic interests. Britain's motives were not purely humanitarian. Abolition became a tool of empire, providing moral justification for military intervention and colonial rule. But it did free many Africans from bondage and ended the export slave trade that had devastated the continent for centuries. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron, established in 1808, patrolled the Atlantic coast for over 60 years, intercepting slave ships and liberating their human cargo. This campaign freed over 150,000 enslaved Africans, though at enormous cost. The tropical climate and disease killed thousands of British sailors in the process. Yet the end of the Atlantic slave trade didn't immediately end slavery within Africa. Colonial governments often tolerated domestic slavery for decades after conquest, fearing that immediate abolition would cause economic chaos or social unrest. In some cases, colonial officials even used slave labor for public works projects, perpetuating the very institution they claimed to oppose. The transition from slavery to colonial rule was complex and contradictory. While Europeans ended the export of slaves, they often imposed new forms of forced labor on African populations. Colonial taxation systems forced Africans to work for European employers to earn money to pay taxes, creating conditions that resembled slavery in all but name. The pain of slavery cannot be overstated. Millions of Africans endured unspeakable suffering, whether across the Atlantic, in Islamic courts, or in African kingdoms. Families were torn apart, cultures destroyed, and entire regions depopulated. The trauma of these experiences reverberates through generations, shaping the modern world in ways we are still discovering. But the truth is more complex than simple narratives of victim and villain. Africans were also raiders, traders, and kings who participated in and profited from the slave trade. They made choices, sometimes forced by circumstances, sometimes driven by greed or ambition, that contributed to one of history's greatest tragedies. This complexity doesn't excuse the horrors of slavery or diminish the suffering of those who endured it, but it does require us to acknowledge the full human dimension of this history. Africans were not passive victims of European exploitation. They were active participants in their own history, for better and worse. Some African rulers like Afonso I tried to regulate the slave trade while profiting from it. Others, like the Oba of Benin, chose to abandon it entirely, recognizing its destructive effects. Still, others like the kings of Dahomey embraced it completely, building their entire civilization around human bondage. These choices had consequences that shaped the modern world. The wealth generated by slave labor built European and American cities, funded industrial development, and created the foundations of modern capitalism. But it also devastated African societies, contributing to centuries of political instability, economic underdevelopment, and social trauma. Today, we must face this truth, not to deflect blame from European and American participation in slavery, but to complete the story. Only by acknowledging the full complexity of this history can we understand how it continues to shape our world today. The legacy of slavery extends far beyond the plantations of the Americas. It influenced the development of racism, shaped patterns of global inequality, and created wounds that have never fully healed. In Africa, the slave trade contributed to political fragmentation, economic stagnation, and social divisions that persist today. But there were also forms of resistance, adaptation, and survival that deserve recognition. Enslaved Africans created new cultures in the Americas, blending traditions from their homeland with influences from their new environments. They fought for freedom, built communities, and maintained their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. In Africa itself, some societies recovered from the devastation of the slave trade and built new forms of prosperity. Others struggled for generations to rebuild their populations and political structures. The colonial period that followed brought its own forms of exploitation and resistance, creating the complex legacies that independent African nations inherited in the 20th century. Africa's history, like all human history, is complicated. It includes both perpetrators and victims, heroes and villains, triumph and tragedy, and it is time we told it completely, without romanticizing the past or ignoring uncomfortable truths. Only by acknowledging the full history of complicity, resistance, and humanity can we begin to honor those who suffered and learn from their experiences. The story of African slavery is not just African history, it is human history, with lessons that remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with the legacies of exploitation, resistance, and survival in our modern world.